So the flavour notes for this say that it's meant to have floral, honey, cinnamon and sandalwood. What does sandalwood taste like? Hey guys, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whisky enthusiast and I love all things whisky, but taste is subjective, so whether you consider yourself a connoisseur or you're just looking to understand more about whisky, let's explore it all together. If you haven't already subscribed, hit that button now. I've got up regular review videos and special interest whisky pieces. You can also follow me over on Instagram. Now, if you're a Scotch drinker, you definitely would have seen a bottle of Dewar's on the shelf at some point. It's a whisky brand that was started in 1846. They're pretty widely available, especially the white label. Now, Dewar's is a blended Scotch, which means it's made with a combination of single malt whiskies and other grain-based whiskies. I've done a whole video on the difference between blends and single malt, so you can watch that for all the details, but ultimately just means that they've taken whiskey from other distilleries and they've mixed it with some slightly cheaper made whiskey in order to blend something together that's readily available and a bit more affordable than your single malts. Now, Dewar's point of difference though is that they marry their blend. So once they've blended the single malts and the grain-based whiskey, they'll then pop it into an oak barrel to age it a little bit further so that that blended whiskey can sort of fuse together to become one. A lot of your blended scotches, they'll mix it all together until it tastes just right, usually matching previous batches, and then they'll just bottle it up and send it straight out. So I believe there are some other scotches blended scotches that do marry them together for further aging, but it's not the normal, whereas for Dewar's it actually is their standard way of operating. Marrying is how they describe it on their website. I've heard distillers refer to it as marrying, I've heard them refer to it as blending. I think usually if you're blending it together to go back into a barrel, they tend to call it marrying. You know, you're marrying multiple barrels together to go for further aging. Whereas if they're getting it ready to actually bottle, that's when they call it blending, and they treat that a little bit more as a craft, whereas marrying is kind of just almost bringing it together and hoping for the best.
Does that make it more expensive than just a blended whiskey that doesn't go back into a barrel?
Well, typically there's more work on behalf of the whiskey brand. If they're marrying them together and then partaking further aging, then yeah, there's a little bit more work on their part, so they can justify charging a little bit more than that for that. Whereas Dewar's, it is still considered an affordable whiskey, especially the white label. But they've been doing some further finishes, which is what I'm getting to now. Now, the Japanese Smooth has been double aged for extra smoothness, they say. So they've done the usual blend, they've aged it further in oak barrels, and then they've put it in another type of cask to finish it, a Mizunara oak. Now, this is called, it's still a Scotch whiskey, but it's called Japanese Smooth because Mizunara oak is a Japanese type of oak. And it's got a really unique flavor, but it's not used a lot for a really good reason. It's a very difficult tree to turn into oak casks. Now, the Japanese started their whiskey industry in the late 1800s, and late 1800s, early 1900s, I don't know. The Japanese whiskey industry started somewhere 100 to 150 years ago, and they followed very much the Scottish traditions. They used American oak, they used European oak. They never really touched their Mizunara oak because the tree grows quite knotty, which makes it really, really difficult to get long, straight staves that you can turn into a barrel. Now, during World War II, for some reason, the Americans didn't want to sell their ex-bourbon barrels to the Japanese, so they found it a little bit hard to get hold of barrels to keep putting their whiskey into. So they started to experiment with the Mizunara oak, and while it was difficult to make a barrel, it imparted some really unique flavors. It brought across things like honey and sandalwood, and it fused together in a type of sweetness that is notably Japanese oak. If you've tasted it before, you will recognize it when you taste it again. Yeah, so with the Mizunara oak, you can expect flavors like sandalwood, sort of incense sort of notes on the nose, vanilla, even coconut. It really is a unique sweetness, which is why I thought this one would actually be pretty interesting. It's a Scottish whiskey that's been aged in Mizunara oak. Now, for those who have watched a few of my reviews, you probably know that I very much lean towards a single malt. I'm not the biggest fan of blends. They have their place, but I just find there's usually more flavor in a single malt than there is in a blended Scotch. Now, the reason why I wanted to try this is because I found out from my father that his father, my grandfather, his favorite whiskey was Dewar's. It was the white label, and I've tried that before. I know it's not to my taste, but I thought when I saw the Japanese Smooth, this might be something that I could get on board with. So the Japanese Smooth retails in Australia for about $60, which is definitely on the lower end of things for whiskey prices here. It's 40% ABV, it's listed as aged 8 years. I'm not sure how long that Mizunara oak cask finish was for. There's actually no rules or regulations on how long whiskey has to be in a barrel to be able to call it a finish. So realistically, you could pop whiskey into the barrel for all of 5 minutes and then pull it out again and call it a finish. I doubt they'd have done that. You'll also notice this bottle is half full. I have already tried it. I tried it in Glencairn. I didn't get a lot of flavor, but I want to give it a little bit more of a fair try, which is why I'm going for the 1920s blender's glass. This is meant to bring a little bit more of the more delicate aromas up to the nose and help you sort of taste some of those. Yeah, I wanted to give it a fair try. So you can see it's a very light color, which Mizunara doesn't really impart a whole lot of color. My assumption would be that the oak that they used before the Mizunara oak would have been ex-bourbon cask, so again, not a whole lot of color there. But I'd call this sort of like a light gold, maybe a straw color. It's a bit darker than straw. And then this is most likely chill filtered. It doesn't say non-chill filtered, which usually a Scotch whisky will do if it isn't. So I'd say this is chill filtered, and you can definitely see that it's not a particularly oily whiskey. It does drain down the glass very quickly. But on the nose, okay, I am getting a little bit more, using the better glass, I am getting a little bit more malt on the nose. And there's definitely sandalwood there. It is a light floral whiskey. Okay, I'm happy with that, because when I tried it first time in the Glencairn glass, I didn't get a really, really strong nose. But there is a little bit more complexity there. I am getting the honey, that sandalwood, those floral notes. I'm not getting cinnamon at this stage. But, Sange. Okay, that is interesting. So having had a little bit more of a stronger nose at the start, I did get a little bit more flavor on the palate. So that honey sort of flavor is a little bit more pronounced. I am getting a very faint hint of cinnamon, but it does actually have a kind of nice, very soft, light, but buttery sort of texture on the mouth. I'm not tasting sandalwood. I don't know what sandalwood is meant to taste like, but it was definitely there on the nose. That honey sort of sweetness, it doesn't disappear immediately. I probably call it a medium finish, but it does have that dry finish that they describe. I mean, if you look at the box, they tell you to expect floral, honey, cinnamon, and sandalwood. Yep. And warm spices and a dry finish. And yeah, so they say delicious honey and floral notes, warm spices, and a dry finish. I do get that. It comes across a lot lighter in a Glencairn or an old-fashioned glass, but those flavors are there, and it is actually, look, it's a light flavor. It's a light whiskey. It's not in your face, so this probably would actually suit people who do like those lighter flavored whiskeys. If you lean more towards the more subtle Speysides and you don't want something cask strength in your face, Yeah, I actually have to apologise to the Dewars, because my first take on this when I first tried it was that it was light and very low on the flavour. I kind of wondered why they bothered using Mizunara casks, you know, because it is expensive, if they weren't going to leave them in long enough to impart much of the flavour, but that flavour is there. It just took a little bit more of a refined glass to be able to pull it out, but that's actually quite nice. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I drank a cask strength whiskey before I tried this one, but I actually do kind of like it now that I've given it a fair go.
So are you going to drink all the whiskies that you don't like through that glass now?
Maybe.
It's another video.
Maybe I need to revisit all the whiskies I didn't like. In all fairness, I did not like this one when I first tried it. I just felt like it didn't have as much flavour as I would have expected initially. Part of that is because the 40% ABV doesn't carry across a lot usually. I suppose with a slightly wider nose glass, it released a little bit more of the flavour before I got to it. I mean, I'll revisit past whiskies just to try it in a different glass. I've got a whole bunch of other types of glasses here I can try. But yeah, it's soft, it's subtle, but it's actually still nice to drink neat. I'm actually really surprised by that. If we're going to be fair, Dewar's, most of your blended whiskies, they're not really designed to be drunk neat. They're made for the mixing market. They're made for bars where you're going to serve it with dry or soda or in a cocktail. You don't really want to, you know, unless you're willing to splash out a lot of money, you're not usually going to use a single malt whiskey in just, you know, a whiskey and dry. So that's what your blended whiskey is for. So to be really fair, we should probably also try this in a whiskey-based cocktail. And I know just the one. So the Japanese Highball is a basic built cocktail involving whiskey, ice, soda water, and a slice of lemon. Now, fun fact, the Japanese Highball as a cocktail was originally created in America in the early 1900s, but it was popularized by Suntory. After World War II, they were trying to find ways to get the Japanese public to consume their own whiskey since they weren't doing well in the export market. And most people would usually want to drink beer. So in order to try and popularize the highball whiskey, the classic Japanese highball, they opened up a bunch of highball bars in areas where people were often on their way home from work. And so they would be wanting a drink at the end of the day. And they even went so far as to create a Japanese highball machine. So like something that would pour this cocktail straight from the tap perfectly every single time. And it worked. It actually popularized the drink and it became a common way for Japanese people to enjoy their own whiskey. And ideally, if you actually appreciate the flavor of whiskey but you don't want to drink a spirit neat, I do think it is one of the best ways to really appreciate whiskey, because you know, you've watered it down a little bit, you've opened it up, you're going to lose some of the more intense flavors, but it's going to allow some of those more subtle flavors to come through. In fact, the bubbles from the soda water even help open that up and bring them out. And the Dewar's website even says that the Japanese highball is a great way to drink this whiskey because it will bring out some of those floral notes. It will bring out the sandalwood and the incense and the honey sort of flavors. And let's face it, we live in Australia, it's hot like 90% of the time. This is probably how I should be drinking my whiskey, but let's give it a try. It's either too subtle or I added too much soda water.
I think it's too much soda water.
Yeah, I think you're right. I can rectify this. Round two. It's funny, it's actually brought the honey back a little bit and let out a little bit more of the cinnamon sort of notes, some of those earthy spices. That is actually light and refreshing. It doesn't necessarily come across as whiskey to me though. I think it's because there isn't a lot of really intense flavors in this. So by watering it down a little bit with the highball, it does bring out those more subtle flavors. It's quite nice. It is quite refreshing. Did you want to try it?
Yep. I think the lemon activates it quite a bit.
It does actually. That's part of that refreshing aspect. But No, I like that. Like, that's not bad. Honestly, like I said, if you like the flavor of whiskey but you don't like drinking a spirit neat, I think the Japanese Highball is for you.
Yeah, that's definitely, I would agree.
Yeah, like I love my old fashions, but it's a different drink. It's got a whiskey flavor in there, but it's got other flavors in there. I wouldn't drink an old fashioned in order to taste what the whiskey tasted like. I would use a whiskey that I know is going to complement an old fashioned. Whereas this still allows you to appreciate the whiskey, which I think is a good way, especially, like I said, in a hot climate like Australia. It's probably how we should all be drinking our whiskey most of the time. But I'm still going to drink my whiskey neat. I'll die on that hill. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised because I previously I wasn't a huge fan of Dewars. I didn't hate on them or anything, but they were, as far as I was concerned, they were really just made to be mixed in bars. But I actually have to say the Japanese Smooth, it's quite drinkable. It's an interesting take, and it's made me kind of keen to try some of the other ones because the Japanese Smooth is the 4th of their cask series. I have seen they've got a Caribbean Smooth and a Mezcal Smooth. There's a couple of other different variations out there. I'd actually be interested in trying those. So if you've tried them, let me know how they turned out. But also, if you're interested in seeing me review those ones, let me know as well. I'll try and track them down. Like I said, they're an affordable whiskey. They're not. Yeah, I'm happy to try these ones. Let me know if you've tried any of these ones. I'd love to know, especially what the Mezcal was like, 'cause I find that can be hit or miss. But ultimately, enjoy what's in your glass, find a way to enjoy what's in your glass, and slash.